For the eyes of the world now look into space, to the moon, and to the planets beyond.
This is The Space Shot, episode 448, The Lunar Era, Part 3, We Came in Peace for All Mankind. I'm John Molnix. I am recovering from another cold, so apologies if I sound a little bit rougher today than normal. The crew of Apollo 11 left a message of peace on the moon, but the story that got us there, and the story that followed, is far more complicated than the words etched on a plaque left on the lunar surface. In this episode, I'm talking with Dr. Roger Launius about some of the larger cultural and geopolitical context of the Apollo era, space exploration more generally, and how this legacy shaped our world today. If you missed parts 1 and 2, now is a perfect time to go back and catch those episodes before continuing with part 3. In this episode, we're going back to the world that made Apollo possible, a time defined by tension, rivalry, and a very real fear that everything could end in a nuclear fire. Here's part 3, We Came in Peace for All Mankind.
Ignition sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff. 32 minutes past the hour. Liftoff on Apollo 11. Tower cleared.
We got a roll program.
Okay, all flight controllers, go for landing. Retro.
Go.
Fido.
Go.
Guidance.
Go.
Control. Go.
Telcom.
Go.
Houston,
GNC.
go.
Go. Ecom.
Go. Roger,
Surgeon.
copy.
Go. Capcom, we're go for landing.
Eagle, Houston, you're go for landing, over.
Stand by for 30.
4 forward. 4 forward, drift into the right a little.
30. 30
Down
seconds.
a half. 30 seconds. Forward, just. Good. Okay. Contact light. Okay, engine stop. ATA at a descent. Mode control both auto. Descent engine command override off. Engine arm off. 413 is in.
We've had shut down.
We copy you down, Eagle.
Okay, everybody, T1, stand by for T1.
Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. Roger, Tranquility. We copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again. Thanks a lot. Thank you. You're looking good here. I'm going to step off the limb now. That's one small step for man. One giant leap for mankind. For those who haven't read the plaque, we'll read the plaque that's on the front landing gear of this limb. There's 2 hemispheres, one showing each of the 2 hemispheres of Earth. Underneath it says, "Here men from the planet Earth first set foot upon the moon, July 1969, AD. We came in peace for all mankind." It has the crew members' signatures and the signature of the President of the United States.
Sure, I'm Roger Launius. I have spent 35 years doing aerospace history in some form or another, written several books on the subject. Most recently, 2024, Smithsonian Books published a Smithsonian Atlas of Space, which I am the author of. And that's sort of a big deal. I will say it's an accomplishment. The American Library Association's organization that oversees reference works have given it the Dartmouth Medal, which is their prize for the best book. When we think of Apollo, even if we don't know very much about it, most of us have probably heard of it, and that we know that it was a moon landing effort in the 1960s. And it was driven in large measure by a Cold War competition between the United States and the Soviet Union. And of course, the Soviet Union doesn't even exist any longer. But it was a big deal in those days. And we cannot understand these early efforts in space without having some sense of that Cold War mindset. We absolutely believed, and the Russians believed too, that we would nuke each other at any moment. It could happen, and the potential for that was very real. And for the first time in human history, and this makes it so unprecedented, the first time in human history, we had the ability to wipe out every living being on this planet. And we had peer competitors on the other side who were sort of intent on trying to do that. So this is what drove so much of the Apollo program. Now, we don't necessarily think about that in the same way anymore, but it's a critical element, and there's a mythology that we've sort of grown up that everybody thought it was great that we went to the moon. That's definitely not true. That's a myth. We did it for this Cold War competition purpose. That purpose was significant and by itself was enough to drive this particular effort. But there was a lot more beyond it as well. I could go on about mythologies. When we look back on it, we view it as this great, bright, shining moment. And those of us who know a little something about the subject, or maybe we lived through it, may think this even more so than those who were not alive at the time. But nonetheless, there's a sense that we had a leadership in the 1960s that said, we're going to do this, we're going to do it by the end of the decade. And lo and behold, we did that. How often does that happen? It doesn't happen very much in anybody's daily life. People promise things all the time and then don't deliver. But this was one in which we did that. So it's a huge success story in that particular sense. But that's only a very small part of this. That mythology also suggests that if we just set our minds to doing something, we will be able to accomplish it. And so it's a sense of American exceptionalism that's behind a lot of these ideas as well. That the United States is different from most of the rest of the world, and that exceptionalism suggests that it's better than the rest of the world.
In the 21st century, you've probably heard about getting support for a moonshot to beat cancer. Obviously, a very good goal and noble goal, or a moonshot for some other program to get it back on track. But the actual moonshot, when we traveled to our moon, didn't exactly have the full support that most people think, especially in light of how much this moonshot cost.
Obviously, it was a huge investment, and it doesn't sound like it today because it was about $24.5 billion in then-year dollars. Multiply that by the inflation factor, and you've got something approaching $500 billion. That's a significant investment. Would we be willing to do that again today if that was the cost to return to the moon? I think I would question that. There are some things with which we will do regardless of the price, but that's not necessarily one of them. But this was about national security, and that's why we were willing to expend those kinds of dollars. But as soon as that price tag gets trotted out, both sides of the political spectrum, on the liberal side as well as the conservative side, we're wasting this money. Why are we doing this? And so there was criticism from both the left and the right of the decision to go to the moon and to carry this out because mostly of the cost. If you were a conservative, you might think, well, our threat is the Soviet Union. Let's put that money into the military and let's do something in that arena. Or another alternative would be, well, maybe we don't need to put more money into the military. Maybe we need a tax cut for the American people. That would be another criticism of this from the political right. The political left would be, oh my goodness, we've got all these problems here on Earth. Why don't we take this same amount of money and expend it toward resolving some of those problems? Feeding those that are hungry, clothing those that are unclothed, providing shelter for those that need it, on and on and on. You can talk about this in that context. And so both sides of the political spectrum had their criticisms of this, but there was a fundamental middle road which said, this is significant. We are doing this because of this national security component in a non-threatening way with the intention of demonstrating to our Soviet competitors and to our allies that we can undertake these great activities this high technology effort and succeed at them, demonstrating our capability in the technological and scientific realm, which translates directly into all kinds of other factors, some of them military, some of them commercial, some of them business, some of them all kinds of other issues. So that is what won the day.
The soft power aspect of Apollo was a geostrategic win for the United States, at a time when two competing visions for the world were vying for dominance. Another interesting aspect of spaceflight is that it has taken on an almost religious aspect for some people, as Dr. Lanius explains.
There is what I contend a religion of spaceflight. And it's one that is built around a set of concepts that are have a lot of religious overtones as we understand religion, including a salvation theology, if you will. And that salvation theology is not an individual salvation like you would find in most religious groups in the world. It's one in which you are saving the species, life on this planet, by transporting it to other locations beyond this planet. And we all know that it's just a question of time before this planet will become uninhabitable. The best case scenario, as Carl Sagan said, was there will be several billion years in the future a last perfect day on Earth. And after that time, the sun will ultimately become a red giant. It will engulf this planet. And if we're not planet hopping through the rest of the galaxy, we will become dead. So this is a way to ensure against that. There's obviously more immediate threats that could destroy life on this planet. We could nuke ourselves out of existence. We could so foul the planet environmentally that we can't survive here, in which case, by the way, I think we probably deserve extinction. And we'll have to see how that unfolds. But the reality is that is a piece of this. And those who are inside the space community, who are aficionados of this effort to become a multiplanetary species, are very much a part of this larger religious dimension here. And it's also wrapped up in sort of our myth of America, because we are a nation that was founded by people who came from somewhere else and took over this land and this territory and tried to create a place that we believed was better. Some cases that was out and out a utopian effort. We are going to create a perfect society here. The Puritans of New England were very much in that particular mindset. They asked themselves the question in England, how can you be a righteous person in an unrighteous land? And their answer was, you can't. All you can do is get away and recreate the society that you believe is the appropriate one. And they did so in Massachusetts Bay and other parts of New England. And they were adamant that everybody's going to follow their rules. And that's, of course, the problem with utopia. It might be your utopia, but it may not be anybody else's. And that is a fundamental challenge. But it's also part and parcel of this larger component of cultural shift. And I would use the term religion in this context.
It's amazing how belief can inspire great things, but it can also distort how we remember them. And speaking of distortions, now's probably as good of time as any to talk about the conspiracy that we didn't land on the moon. Dr. Lanius has some strong words for those moon landing deniers.
Well, okay, let me preface that by saying anybody who believes that we never went to the moon has deficiencies in their education or their intelligence, or both. There were hundreds of thousands of people that engaged in this activity. And you just don't keep a secret like that in that particular context. It's fascinating to think about. So my grandfather, who was over 75 when we landed on the moon. He's a product of the 19th century. When he was a boy. There weren't much in the way of cars, automobiles, certainly no flight with airplanes or anything like that at that particular point in time. So he was very suspect of these sorts of things. But I will say this about him, and he made a statement that I've seen lots of people make in other settings at other times. Well, those guys in Hollywood, they can fake anything. And they can and they can't, quite frankly. I look at some of these special effects and I'm just not particularly impressed. But be that as it may, he's not a guy you should take your cue from. He was a farmer his entire life, and he only ever used horses for farming. He never had a tractor. As far as he was concerned, it was a passing fad. So you can't listen to people like my grandfather about stuff like this. And he would accept this kind of idea because he was unsophisticated and he didn't have much of an education. He was certainly a smart enough guy, but he was not well read and he did not study this and he didn't understand technology. And by the way, if you're farming with horses when you've got tractors that are doing the job a whole lot better, suggests that you don't know much about technology. The reality is that at the time of the moon landings, you've got some people who begin to say these sorts of things. The science editor from the New York Times went over to a couple of bars that he frequented in New York City, and there were some guys who sort of stayed in there every day, Cliff and Norm or whoever it happened to be, Sam Malone and the guys from Cheers. A couple of know-it-alls who spout all kinds of stuff, most of which is incorrect. And he talked to these guys about landing on the moon, and they would say, I don't think they did this kind of stuff. And he sort of took a poll of people who were sort of hanging out in bars about this and found that, well, about half of them thought there might be something to this and there might be something that's, not quite right about it. So the jury was out, and we've seen this over and over again. And the 50 plus years since we landed on the moon, people have continued to sort of make the same arguments that were debunked and have been debunked many, 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 many times. And I can debunk them now. I don't see a point to it because, quite frankly, if you don't want to believe me, you're just going to say I'm part of the conspiracy, which I've had numerous people tell me that I am, which is sort of interesting. So the Russians had both the desire and the capability to call a fake if it was indeed a fake. And they never said a word. In fact, they congratulated the Americans and were really quite impressed.
Francis French joins us again to share his unique take on these deniers.
What a more of an ultimate compliment is it that something seems so audacious, so outrageous, so impossible that a large number of people don't think it was ever possible? That's actually quite a compliment. Now, you drill down a little bit further and people start making ridiculous arguments and start holding that position when shown evidence. That's a different story. Some of those people are just want to be dumb, basically. But the initial idea of, we can't have done that, what a compliment.
So right now we've got some people who, for whatever reason, will choose to remember the Apollo program as a conspiracy. And as we move farther away from these historic missions, history will hopefully remember these conspiracies as an aberration. The incredible triumph for the United States and for humans will be that we moved beyond Earth for the first time. Here's what Dr. Lanius had to say when I asked him about what will be remembered 100 or a few hundred years in the future.
The excitement of setting feet, putting boots on the ground and a body beyond Earth is something that will be remembered 500 years from now. People will talk about that. They will know that. Think back 500 years in time. Unless you're a historian, you probably don't know very much about this. And there are a lot of historians, myself included, who certainly are not masters of things, say, in 1500 or even 1600, knows something about certain parts of it, but only a small amount. But there are some big, significant events from that era that can be recounted by almost anybody. And the wars of conquest, the exploration of the Americas, the movement into Africa, the movement into Asia, those sorts of things of the European expansion are the one things that a lot of people can point to and say, oh, that took place 500 years ago. Actually, a little more than that, but not that much more. And I think when you look back on the 20th century, 100 years from now, you're probably going to remember only a few things about it. Probably the two great world wars will be something that a lot of people will know something about. The use of an atomic bomb and the rise of nuclear power, either discredited or used, will be something a lot of people will know about. And I think the moon landings will be something that people will know about. Beyond that, in terms of space, they may not know very much about planetary exploration and robots sent to Mars and things of that nature, unless there's a follow-on set of activities that sort of solidify that in their mind and it becomes routine for us 100 years in the future. It might, but we don't know that yet.
The Apollo program is one of those rare moments in human history that may not be eroded by the passage of time. I also asked Rebecca Boyle this same question. What will future generations remember?
Really, if you think about the scope of human history in the last 1,000 years, aviation, yeah, I would put that up there. I would put up the age of sail, the ability of humans to travel across the whole globe and to circumnavigate and to understand how to get there. Even that, yeah, steam is a faster way of doing that, but, it's still navigation itself is what enabled it. And then, the humans left this planet and walked on another one, And the moon's not a planet. I know, I don't need to get emails about that. But, a planetary body. It's a celestial object. And the fact that we did that, it's nuts. Think about how weird it. We, put these young men on a bomb and we're go away from here for a week and come back. And hopefully you make it back alive. And maybe grab some rocks too while you're at it, because that would help us. And that has been the real story of Apollo, actually, I think, is the history of the geology of the moon and the Earth system. We learn about that. But yeah, it's an absurd thing that we did. It's nuts. And I honestly can't imagine it happening today in the same way that it did in the 60s.
Apollo looks inevitable in hindsight, but at the time, it was absurd. Ambitious almost to the point of recklessness. And that is part of what makes this period in history so special. The Apollo program may have come about in the Cold War, but interestingly enough, the people that flew these missions often transcended those disagreements and conflicts when they were in space. Francis French joins us again.
One thing you see about pilots in World War memorials, in reunions after Korea, Vietnam, World War II, the Gulf, you name it, is often there have been people who have been flying against each other, trying to kill each other. A couple of years later, they are drinking and laughing and saying, you remember this, remember that, I was there, you were on the other side. And for outsiders, civilians like me, some of that seems really strange, because you're thinking this was your mortal enemy. But the interesting thing, when I was writing the books about the Soviet Union cosmonauts as much as the American astronauts, trying to tell these human stories of people, is most pilots just love to fly. They do care, they're patriotic, they love their country, but given an airplane, that's what they're there for. They're there to fly. Yuri Gagarin, for example, first person in space, came from a very poor background. And at a certain point, he realized flying is what he wanted to do. He joined a hobby club, learned to fly, and he went, how do I keep doing this? Like most people around the world, you join your military. Does that mean you suddenly become a huge advocate of every policy your country is trying to do? Probably not. Maybe you do, but most people are like, I just really want to fly airplanes. They're going to pay me to fly planes? Great, I'm going to do that. So the things that these flyers have in common, no matter where they're from, are often a lot more than the things that keep them apart, which is more up to the politicians. And at the beginning of the space program, there were all kinds of conversations about the very first time American astronauts met Russian cosmonauts at an air show in a neutral European area. There was conversations up to the last couple of hours of, is this going to be okay? Maybe they should just walk by and see if they're there, and if they do, go over and shake hands, but this can't be a formal thing. All these conversations, which the pilots didn't care. They just wanted to go over and say hello and have a drink. You saw this very much with Alexei Leonov, the first person to walk in space, one of the original Soviet cosmonauts, and Tom Stafford, American astronaut, who they had been flying in East Germany and West Germany, ready to take off and shoot each other down if the Cold War got hot. That was what they were there to do. They were trained to kill each other. And yet a few years later, in 1975, they're making the very first handshake in space as two different countries send two different spacecraft up in space to dock, and they remark on that, particularly as they fly over Germany and go, look, down there, that's where we were trying to kill each other. Now we're up here as best friends, and they stayed lifelong friends. So these things do supersede that.
After the Apollo, Skylab, and Apollo-Soyuz missions, NASA entered a nearly 6-year period, about 2,088 days to be precise, before NASA's first shuttle mission, STS-1. During the shuttle program, NASA learned some hard lessons, and today the Artemis program will hopefully benefit from those lessons that have been learned over the past few decades. Here's Dr. Lanius.
Well, I mean, we have to, obviously we have to relearn over and over again how hard this is to do. It is difficult to fly in space. It's difficult to fly anyway, but it's difficult to fly in space, especially the extremes of the environment, the difficulties of reaching it, the sustainment of long-term missions. Those are things that you sort of have to relearn over and over and over again. And even when you think you've got certain things learned, I mean, for instance, the space shuttle program was intended to be routine access to space, do it on a regular basis. In fact, the mission model in the 1970s, in the early 1970s anyway, but the point that they were just starting to build the shuttle, was going to be 50 missions a year. Can you imagine a space shuttle flight every week? Basically, that's what we're talking about. Well, it got cut back and cut back and cut back and cut back, as you know, and it wasn't feasible. And a question you have to ask is, what would you be doing in space with 50 space shuttles a year? You know, safety is prime. Accomplishing the mission is secondary to safety is prime, but you still want to accomplish the mission. And by the time of the Challenger accident in January of 1986, they had 25 missions under their belts, or they had 24. They were working on 25, and they lost a shuttle and killed a crew, and it's a horrific, horrible experience. And they had sort of forgotten some of the things that were prime previously and had become a little bit sort of complacent in these sorts of things. There were all of these efforts after the fact to understand not just the technical cause of the problem, which they knew pretty quickly what the problem was, and they knew the fix for that. But the larger issue was, how do you keep these things from happening again? Not this specifically one, but anything else. You don't want people to become complacent. And so they really worked hard on cultural change at NASA to try to focus on that. And the agency went back to flight 2.5 years, 30 months later, basically. And they successfully flew. They had glitches, they had problems, they had some crises, but they flew successfully without the loss of a crew. Again, until STS-107 in 2003, when they lost Columbia. And it was exactly the same problem. The cultural mindset that was driving the changes at NASA had to be relearned after that. How many times do we have to relearn these things? And I would contend that it's an ongoing process. And it's especially true in the context of operations, where you're doing the same thing day after day after day. How can you not get complacent? It's hard to do. And that's going to be a challenge moving forward. And that's one of the things that I hope NASA appreciates fundamentally. I mean, you know, this next mission to orbit with a crew around the moon on Artemis is probably going to be the safest mission they'll ever fly, because everybody's on their toes. Nobody wants this to fail. And you certainly don't want to have yourself be implicated in that process of failure. If you're doing it over and over and over again, it becomes harder and harder to do.
The space program also opened up technical possibilities that laid the groundwork for the digital world we live in today. Dr. Lanius shared this insight about an incredible piece of technology called the Apollo Guidance Computer.
Can I just give one example of this that we don't hear a lot? You know, and I'm not talking about spinoffs here. NASA loves to talk about spinoffs. Things that found commercial product release after NASA sort of spent money investing in it to use it on spaceflight. There are things that happen like that, no question about it. But some of the things are accidental, and this is one. So in 1961, Kennedy said, let's go to the moon. NASA then begins the process of developing the technologies and creating the processes and training the astronauts and doing all the stuff that led to the moon landings. One of those things that they did was contract with the Stark Draper Instrumentation Lab at MIT to build an Apollo guidance computer. And it had to be a certain size, and it had to be a certain shape, and it had to have a certain amount of memory, none of which is very sophisticated from our perspective, but nonetheless, it was state-of-the-art in 1961. And Draper Lab brought together 500 or so of the best minds they could find in computing and put them to work working on this problem of building this guidance computer. And they built it, and it worked like a dream. And again, and I've seen lots of people at NASA and other places pull their cell phone out at this point and say, you have more computing power in your phone than they had in the Apollo guidance. And that's true. But the reason why you have that computing power is what happened next. At the end of the Apollo program, there's no more use for these people working at the Draper Lab building the Apollo guidance computer. They left that institution and they moved to universities and they moved to industry and they moved to think tanks and they went everywhere you can imagine, taking with them the knowledge they had gained from building that computer and their Rolodex. And when I say Rolodex, younger people look at me and say, what's that? I said, it's just your list of contacts. That's all it is. Their phone numbers, how to reach them, that kind of stuff. They took that with them and they seeded the microcomputing industry of the 1970s, setting in train a whole series of innovations that lead to our modern computing. And I don't know it's not that we never would have gotten there without them, but we wouldn't have gotten there as quickly. And that is an enormous benefit from this process, indirect, never intended by anybody, but I would contend is really significant. And there's lots of those kinds of stories.
The Apollo missions were conducted in a world steeped in conflict, fear, hope, and ambition. The meaning of these missions stretch far beyond the actual missions themselves. They've steeped into our culture, technology, and collective memory. We also have the physical story of Apollo. The capsules, spacesuits, cameras, moon rocks, all those pieces that returned to Earth. These artifacts help tell the story of Apollo for the next generation. Next time, we're going to catch up with Jim Remar and Michelle Hanlon to talk about these artifacts and landing sites and how it's crucial for us to preserve this history, both to remember the incredible accomplishments, but also to set the norms for behavior as humans return to the moon in the 21st century. Thanks for listening to The Space Shot. As always, please leave a rating or review on your podcast platform of choice. It helps more people find out about the work that I'm doing here. You can also support the work I'm doing by checking out the store I've got, Starlight and Gleam. There's some fun space-themed pieces there that would make a great Christmas present for the space enthusiast in your life. If you'd like to ask a question, you can also reach me at 720-772-7988. Just leave a message and I might play it during an upcoming Q&A episode that I'll do after this series wraps up. You can also check out my Substack for more updates, looks behind the scenes, and even more space history. Music for this episode was licensed via Blue Dot Sessions. Full track information and links are in the show notes. Thanks for listening. I'm John Molnix, and I'll catch you on the flip side.